From just watching the movies alone, it seems that the Jedi as a whole are widely supported and respected by the people of the galaxy that they claim to protect and to bring peace to. However, that's far from reality, and this notion that everyone loved the Jedi is actually quite false. So why were the Jedi disliked so much, and what caused them to become the most hated group of people following their destruction after Order 66? Although this anti-Jedi sentiment really began to pick up nearing the start of the Clone Wars, there was always a dislike towards them throughout their entire history, especially the more they got involved within galactic affairs. To put it simply, the Jedi were pretty much always involved in massive conflicts that caused the destruction of countless lives, and many of these conflicts were fought against the Sith, whom the Jedi claimed to be the absolute evil and a force that needed to be eliminated, even at the cost of millions of innocent lives. The issue with that was most people in the galaxy had no idea what the Sith were or why they needed to be eliminated. To many of them, it really seemed like the Jedi were just wiping out the competition. The public didn't really understand the Force, or many of the complications of what the light and the dark side were, or what made them so different from each other. To them, the Force was just magic that some beings could use, and in their eyes, abuse for their own benefit. Actually, it was quite common for beings to view Jedi and Sith as the same, just two organizations with magical powers that sought power in the galaxy, and they believed they had the right to dictate how things should be. The vast population of the galaxy was so ignorant of what Jedi were, that many of them even confused re-emerging Sith to be Jedi, nearing the last days of the Republic. We see this with Darth Maul, who gets called a Jedi after igniting his red lightsaber, and even Darth Plagueis, who was believed to be a Jedi after he used his lightsaber and Force abilities to kill an entire crew of smugglers, later being told that he brought shame to the Jedi Order by one of the smugglers right before he died. And it's no surprise that people were ignorant of what the Sith were, and what made them so different from the Jedi. Any texts that went over the history of the Sith were forbidden on most worlds, especially those ruled by the Republic. Some distant planets on the Outer Rim had people that didn't even believe the Jedi were real, with them usually hearing more bad than good about them, like how they kidnap babies and supposedly cut down women with their laser swords. Anyway, this dislike of the Jedi increased the more corrupt the Republic got. Since the Republic didn't have any centralized military force, the Jedi were instead relied upon to enforce their policies, even those that were completely unjust. For example, the Trade Federation and the Huk manipulated the Senate to send Jedi to wipe out the advancing Kaleesh back to their homeworld, and later to impose crippling sanctions on their economy, even though the Kaleesh were literally fighting for their freedom against the enslavement from the Huk. The Senate decided to side with the Trade Federation because they had a far greater presence and influence within the Senate than the Kaleesh did. And since the Jedi were the ones who did the dirty work, most of the blame was placed on them by the people affected by their enforcement of the Senate's decision. Also, even when the Jedi were sent to worlds to settle conflicts through peaceful means among two sides, they still received backlash, either by the people or leaders of the planet. People generally don't like having things decided for them by off-worlders. They liked having power to decide for themselves how things should be, not to have a group of out-of-touch monks come in and tell them how their things should be. And that's what it really came down to, and was one of the reasons the Jedi Order failed to appease the masses. They were too out of touch with the public they preached that they were serving. Most of the time, they only discussed the issues with the elite class of the planet's societies, not with the common people who were being directly affected by said issues. This gave the perception of the Jedi as glorified police of the elite, whose sole purpose was to keep the wealthy in power. Glorified police that kidnap babies to brainwash them so that they could serve their cult-like order. This became such a pressing problem that mercenaries were hired to steal back the babies from the Jedi and to bring them back to their biological parents. Later on, the People's Inquest was created, which was a group of concerned citizens who kept their eyes on the Jedi and protested their increased involvement in galactic affairs. This isn't to say that the Jedi didn't do any good. They did a lot of good, actually, from bringing medical supplies to worlds that had been devastated by natural disasters, to resolving conflicts where everyone was satisfied. But they also did a ton of bad as well, as mentioned earlier, and typically the public pays far more attention to the bad than the good. Also, this slow rise of anti-Jedi sentiment was actually propagated by the Sith throughout the millennia leading up to the Clone Wars. They purposely set the seeds of chaos and conflict to arise throughout the galaxy, as a means of undermining the Jedi's authority. The more problems that arose, the more likely that the galaxy would start blaming the people in charge, who so happened to be the Jedi at the time. And the Jedi didn't actually ever go out of their way to actually change anything. They just went out to resolve conflicts on the surface level. They mainly went out to make sure that there wouldn't be any fighting among opposing sides, but they typically didn't stay long enough to get to the root of the problem and resolve it in the long term. As a consequence, these problems would usually reappear again and just build up over time, which painted the Jedi as ineffective at creating and maintaining long-term peace. Once the Separatist crisis started, and their leader was Count Dooku, the citizens of the Republic became even more angered at the Jedi, as the leader of the Separatists was a former Jedi. To the Republic citizens, Dooku was a traitor in their eyes, and him once being part of the Jedi Order didn't help the Order's public image. For the first time in history, the idea that the Jedi could betray the Republic became widespread across the galaxy, which was hardened even more once it became public that other Jedi were joining Dooku's crusade against the Republic. Then the Clone Wars started, which was publicized as the fault of the Jedi, from senators who disliked them to even Palpatine, who subtly legitimized the idea that the Jedi created the war in order to gain more power by mentioning these claims in his speeches. Even though he publicly denounced these claims to be foolish, the mere fact of bringing them up frequently in his speeches made the public more suspicious of whether or not they were true, which was all a part of his plan. The Clone Wars not only caused the deaths of hundreds of millions, if not billions of beings, but it also made the lives of every citizen in the Republic far more difficult. Even those who lived on planets that were never invaded by the Separatists had to sacrifice a lot for the war effort. Hundreds of billions of beings had to give up basic essentials like electricity or even clean water, as the Republic diverted funds from public services to the war machine. A vast majority of these funds went to funding the clone army, which itself alone was bankrupting the Republic. And guess who bought the clone army? The Jedi. And the public was reminded of this fact too. Not only was the use of the clone army, which was basically a slave army, immoral, but it also was the main cause of why billions of families had their power and water shut off. Sure, Palpatine authorized the creation of a grand army, but it was the Jedi who forced the clone army to be the Grand Army's backbone. Although it is true that had they not done so, the Republic would have lost a ton of territory before creating a Grand Army out of recruitments. The public wouldn't have known this. The average person doesn't care or understand what could have been. They only care what's happening and what's affecting them at the current moment. And at the climax of the war, they knew that their lives were far worse then because of the war and the use of the clone army, which they believed were both fault of the Jedi. There's a reason why the anti-war protests were at the Jedi Temple, and not the Senate or executive buildings. Palpatine expertly manipulated the entire public to believe that the war and all of their immediate problems were solely caused by the Jedi, and them alone. As the Jedi's approval ratings tanked, Palpatine's approval ratings went through the roof. He portrayed himself as a strong leader who felt the same frustrations and anger that the citizens had over the war. Propaganda portrayed him in a positive light, and as the sole reason why the Separatists hadn't taken over the Republic, which is kind of ironic, as the Jedi were literally the ones fighting and dying in the war, while Palpatine was taking all of the credit. What's even more ironic was that Palpatine was the one who secretly orchestrated the war himself, while the Jedi were being blamed for it all. Finally, the time came when the Jedi were told of Palpatine's true identity and his real agenda. Arrogant and rash with their decision, Mace Windu and 3 other Jedi Masters believed it was best to confront Palpatine alone and to force him out of his democratically elected office. But Palpatine was able to use this to his own advantage, using the forceful act from the Jedi as evidence of their true intentions of trying to take over the Republic and to blame them for the Clone Wars as just a diversion for trying to take control, justifying his use of Order 66 and the creation of the Empire. In his new order, he proclaimed that the power would go back to the people instead of the hypocritical and corrupt Jedi enforcing order, and that responsibility would go to the people who make up the backbone of the new Imperial military as they phased out the clones over the course of the next few years. Of course, this was all a sham to boost Palpatine's hold on the galaxy, while he slowly gained a direct grip on the galaxy as his new military built itself up and spread across the galaxy. So in the end, the galaxy initially had mixed opinions on the Jedi, with some viewing them as peacekeepers, while others viewed them as enforcers of a corrupt government. But as time went on, these opinions got more negative as the media and opponents of the Jedi made it loud and clear that the Clone Wars and all of the hardships that the people were going through were the fault of the Jedi. This distrust and hatred of the Jedi got to the point where people were able to accept that the Jedi had fallen so far that they would try to seize power for themselves and that they needed to be destroyed. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. And as always, may the Force be with you.